I knew something was wrong before I even got out of my truck. You ever have one of those moments where your brain sees something, but it refuses to process it because the image in front of you makes absolutely no sense? That was me. I had just gotten back from a 6-week trip overseas, exhausted, jet-lagged, carrying too much luggage, and already thinking about how good it would feel to walk my favorite trail through the woods behind my property. That trail wasn't just some random path through the trees. I'd spent years maintaining it. My land covered nearly a dozen acres of protected woodland outside a small town in Oregon, and the winding trail that cut through the forest had existed for decades before I ever bought the place. It followed a natural ridge line, crossed a small seasonal creek, and ran through a conservation area filled with native plants and wildlife. Deer used it. Birdwatchers loved it. I loved it. It was probably my favorite thing about the entire property. So when I turned the corner near the eastern section of the trail and saw bright white lines painted across gray concrete, I honestly thought I was hallucinating. Right there, directly across the center of my conservation land, sat a massive basketball court. Not a temporary setup, not a portable hoop, an actual full-size sports court. Fresh concrete, painted lines, industrial lighting poles, fencing. The whole thing looked like it belonged behind a high school gymnasium. For a few seconds I just stood there staring. The court stretched across the trail like someone had dropped a parking lot into the middle of a forest. The path disappeared beneath the concrete slab and reappeared on the other side. My first thought was that there had been some kind of survey mistake. Maybe a contractor got confused. Maybe they accidentally crossed a property line by a few feet. Then I pulled up the property map on my phone. No mistake. The entire structure sat squarely on my land. Every inch of it. And suddenly I knew exactly who was responsible. About 2 months earlier, a couple named Garrett and Nicole had purchased the estate next door. They came from Seattle, arrived with a lot of money and even more confidence, and immediately started talking about turning their property into what they called a wellness retreat. The first time I met Garrett, he acted friendly enough. I was clearing fallen branches after a storm when he wandered over wearing expensive hiking gear that still had store tags hanging from the zipper. He asked questions about wildlife, conservation programs, and local trails. At the time I thought he seemed genuinely interested. Looking back now, I think he was gathering information. During that conversation, I specifically mentioned that the trail was entirely within my property boundaries. I even pointed toward the conservation markers. Apparently none of that mattered. I called Garrett immediately. He answered on the second ring, sounding cheerful. "Hey neighbor," he said. "Back from your trip?" I skipped the small talk. "Why is there a basketball court on my land?" There was a pause. Not a shocked pause. Not a confused pause. More like the pause of someone deciding which excuse to use first. Then he laughed. Actually laughed. "Oh, that. We thought that old trail was abandoned." I remember gripping the phone so hard my hand hurt. "Abandoned?" I said. "It's a protected conservation trail." He sighed dramatically. "Look, our contractor said the area wasn't being used. Besides, the court looks great. People can still walk around it. Walk around it. Through dense brush. Around a giant concrete slab that shouldn't exist in the first place." I told him he had built directly on protected land, and that I had surveys proving ownership. The friendly tone vanished instantly. It was like a switch flipped. "Then get a lawyer," he snapped. "We're not tearing anything down." And there it was. The real Garrett. Not the smiling, eco-friendly neighbor. Not the community-minded wellness retreat owner. Just another guy who believed money could rewrite reality. I hung up and walked the perimeter of the court. The longer I looked, the angrier I got. The construction crews had cut through native vegetation. They had compacted protected soil. They had destroyed sections of habitat restoration work that volunteers had helped me complete years earlier. What bothered me most wasn't even the concrete. It was the arrogance. Someone had looked at protected woodland, ignored every marker, ignored every boundary, ignored basic respect, and decided their recreational project mattered more than the law. As the sun started dropping behind the trees, I called the only person I trusted to handle something this ridiculous. My attorney, Daniel Mercer. After I explained what happened, there was silence for about 5 seconds. Then he said something I will never forget. "Tell me you're taking pictures," he said. "Because if this is exactly what you're describing, your neighbor just made a very expensive mistake." At that point, I still thought this would end with a stern letter and an apology. I had no idea the fight was about to get much bigger, much uglier, and far more satisfying than I ever imagined. Now, before I get back to the chaos, let me explain why Garrett's confidence was so bizarre. A lot of people assume property disputes are basically two neighbors arguing over a fence line, and sometimes that's true. But this situation was completely different. According to standard procedure, when you're planning a major construction project near a property boundary, one of the first things you're supposed to verify is exactly where that boundary sits. That's not optional. That's construction 101. From a legal perspective, the moment you pour permanent concrete on someone else's land, you're stepping into territory that can get expensive very fast. What made this even worse was the conservation designation attached to the trail. Protected land comes with additional restrictions, environmental responsibilities, and oversight. In other words, Garrett wasn't just gambling with a neighbor dispute. He was gambling with environmental regulations too. And honestly, I think that's where psychology enters the picture. This is a psychological trap that catches a surprising number of entitled people. They spend so much time convincing themselves they're right that they stop checking whether they're actually right. Once that happens, every warning sounds like a personal attack instead of useful information. Unfortunately for Garrett, reality doesn't care how confident you are. The next morning, Daniel met me at his office with survey maps spread across a conference table. I expected him to spend hours digging through records, but within 20 minutes he looked up and shook his head. "This isn't even close," he said. The property lines were crystal clear. The conservation easement was crystal clear. The basketball court wasn't partially on my land. It wasn't mostly on my land. It was entirely on my land. Every square foot of concrete, every lighting pole, every fence post. Daniel immediately contacted a licensed surveyor to confirm the records and ordered a fresh site review just in case. 3 days later, the results came back exactly the same. Garrett had somehow managed to build an entire recreational complex without verifying ownership of the ground underneath it. Daniel drafted a formal demand letter requiring immediate removal of the court and restoration of the protected habitat. We gave Garrett 7 days to comply. 7 days to fix a problem he created. 7 days to avoid what was coming. His response arrived through a large law firm downtown. The letter was incredible. According to their argument, the land had been underutilized before construction and the new sports facility provided community value. Community value. I actually laughed when I read it. Imagine breaking into someone's garage, parking your car inside, and then arguing that you improve the neighborhood by increasing vehicle storage capacity. That was basically their legal strategy. The letter even suggested that I should appreciate having access to a high-quality recreational court whenever I wanted. Daniel read that paragraph twice and smiled. "Good," he said. "Let them keep writing things like this." Instead of removing the court, Garrett doubled down. Every weekend there were games. Music blasted through speakers. SUVs lined the edge of the access road. Strangers wandered across sections of protected woodland carrying coolers and folding chairs. The place looked like a youth sports tournament. The more outrageous part was that Garrett acted like he owned everything around him. One Saturday, I walked over and found nearly 30 people using the court. Garrett spotted me and waved like we were old friends. "See," he shouted. "People love it." I pointed toward the conservation markers. "You're trespassing." He rolled his eyes. "My attorney says we're fine." I remember thinking that if his attorney really said that, then his attorney was about to have a very bad month. As the weeks passed, Daniel filed for emergency injunctive relief. The environmental documentation became a major factor. Inspectors reviewed the disturbed habitat. Reports documented vegetation loss and soil disruption. The conservation agency submitted findings supporting restoration. Suddenly, this wasn't just me versus my neighbor. Government agencies were paying attention. That's when Garrett started making mistake after mistake. He posted photos of tournaments online. He bragged about the project. He gave interviews to local community groups discussing future expansion plans. Expansion plans. On land he didn't own. Every new photograph became evidence. Every public statement became evidence. Every boast became evidence. Daniel joked that Garrett was building our case for us free of charge. About a month after filing, we finally reached the hearing. The courtroom wasn't crowded, but the atmosphere felt heavy. Garrett arrived wearing an expensive suit and carrying the confidence of someone who had spent most of his life getting his way. Judge Holloway entered, reviewed the file, and immediately started asking questions. Not friendly questions. Direct questions. Specific questions. Questions Garrett clearly wasn't prepared to answer. Did you obtain a survey before construction? The judge asked. Garrett's attorney hesitated. Not a formal survey. Strike 1. Did you verify ownership of the construction site? Another hesitation. Strike 2. Were you aware the area was subject to conservation restrictions? The silence that followed seemed to last forever. Strike 3. The judge spent nearly 2 hours reviewing documents, photographs, environmental reports, easement records, and survey data. Then he leaned back in his chair and delivered the kind of ruling attorneys dream about. He stated that ownership was undisputed. He stated that the conservation protections were valid and enforceable. He stated that the construction constituted unauthorized encroachment onto protected private property. Then came the sentence that changed everything. Immediate removal authorized. No delay. No grace period. No additional waiting. The order was effective immediately. Garrett looked stunned. His attorney looked even worse. Meanwhile, Daniel calmly closed his notebook and whispered, "Let's schedule demolition." We did exactly that. Less than 24 hours later, I stood beside a demolition contractor named Victor Ramirez. Victor specialized in concrete removal and had the kind of practical attitude you only develop after decades operating heavy equipment. He studied the court, nodded once, and said, "Well, this thing picked the wrong place to exist." We coordinated with environmental officials and restoration specialists. Everything was documented. Every step was approved. Every requirement was followed. At sunrise the next morning, the demolition began. The first jackhammer strike echoed through the trees like a gunshot. Cracks spread across the concrete surface. Another strike. Another crack. Then another. Within an hour, massive sections of the court had broken apart. The painted lines disappeared beneath piles of shattered concrete. Excavators lifted chunks into waiting trucks. Rebar emerged from the rubble like exposed skeletons. Workers cut it apart and hauled it away. The lighting poles came down next. One by one they were disconnected, removed, and loaded for disposal. I won't lie. Watching it happen felt incredibly satisfying. Not because I enjoy destruction. Quite the opposite. I hated that the court had ever been built. But every broken slab represented restoration. Every truckload represented accountability. By the end of the first day, most of the structure was gone. By the second day, crews had excavated the artificial base material beneath the court. Compacted gravel was removed. Damaged soil was treated. Restoration experts began preparing the site for native vegetation recovery. The transformation was remarkable. It was as if the forest was taking a deep breath after being smothered. Late that afternoon, just as the final truck prepared to leave, Garrett and Nicole arrived. I'll never forget the look on Garrett's face. Pure disbelief. He stared at the empty clearing where his basketball court had stood only 48 hours earlier. Then came the yelling. Lots of yelling. He stormed toward us shouting about destroyed investments, property damage, financial losses, and legal consequences. He threatened lawsuits. He threatened appeals. At one point, he actually demanded that we stop loading debris that no longer belonged there. I handed him a copy of the court order. The judge authorized immediate removal, I said. This is the result. His face turned bright red. For a second I thought he might explode. Instead he called the police. 2 officers arrived, reviewed the documents, reviewed the court order, and essentially told him there was nothing they could do. The demolition was lawful. The court ruling was valid. The property was mine. Watching that reality settle in was almost painful. Almost. A few weeks later, Garrett attempted one final move. He filed a claim seeking compensation for construction costs, materials, and alleged damages totaling roughly $50,000. The argument didn't last long. The court dismissed it. More importantly, the judge ruled that Garrett's actions had directly created the dispute and ordered him to cover a substantial portion of my legal expenses. By the time everything ended, he had lost the court, lost the case, lost the money he spent building it, lost additional money fighting it, and gained a reputation around town that wasn't exactly flattering. As for me, I finally got my trail back. The forest grew quieter. Wildlife returned. Native plants began recovering. And every time I walked that restored path, I couldn't help smiling at the absurdity of the whole thing. Garrett thought he was building something permanent. In reality, he was pouring $40,000 worth of concrete into one of the most expensive lessons of his life. A few months after everything was over, I took a walk down that trail on a quiet autumn morning. No construction noise. No bright lights hanging over the trees. No weekend tournaments. Just wind moving through the branches and the sound of birds somewhere deeper in the woods. If you'd visited the property that day, you probably never would have guessed a full-size basketball court had existed there only a short time earlier. Nature has a funny way of reclaiming space when people stop getting in its way. And honestly, that's when I finally had enough distance from the conflict to think about what really happened. Because this story was never actually about a basketball court. The concrete was just the symptom. The real issue was entitlement. Garrett didn't wake up one morning planning to become the villain in a property dispute. At least I don't think he did. What happened was something I see more and more these days. People become so accustomed to getting quick results that they start believing obstacles are optional. If a piece of land looks unused, they assume nobody cares about it. If a neighbor seems quiet, they assume that neighbor won't fight back. If a rule becomes inconvenient, they convince themselves the rule probably doesn't matter. The lesson here is that reality eventually catches up with that mindset. Sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. In this case, it arrived in the form of survey maps, environmental reports, court orders, and demolition equipment. According to standard procedure, property ownership exists whether someone respects it or not. Boundaries don't disappear because they're inconvenient. Easements don't become meaningless because a contractor wants an easier construction site. And protected land doesn't stop being protected simply because somebody has a bigger budget than everyone else around them. From a legal perspective, one of the most expensive mistakes people make is assuming confidence can replace verification. It can't. The survey doesn't care how certain you feel. The judge doesn't care how much money you've already spent. The law doesn't suddenly bend because admitting a mistake would be embarrassing. And if there's another lesson buried inside this whole mess, it's one that goes beyond property disputes. This is a psychological trap that affects people in every part of life. Once someone becomes emotionally invested in being right, evidence starts feeling like an enemy. Every warning becomes an attack. Every disagreement becomes personal. Instead of stopping and reassessing, they double down. Garrett had multiple opportunities to avoid disaster. He could have checked the property line before construction. He could have stopped when the demand letter arrived. He could have removed the court voluntarily before the hearing. Instead, each new warning pushed him further into denial until the consequences became impossible to avoid. In the end, the forest recovered. The trail survived. The conservation area remained protected. And maybe that's the part that feels most satisfying. Not the courtroom victory. Not the legal fees. Not even watching the demolition. It's knowing that something worth preserving was preserved. So now I'm curious what you think. If you came home and discovered a neighbor had built a permanent structure on your property, would you have handled it differently? Would you have tried to negotiate longer? Or would you have gone straight to court? Let me know in the comments because stories like this always seem to divide people right down the middle. And trust me, around here, whenever someone brings up the famous disappearing basketball court, the debate still starts all over again.